I hope you'll join me as we dive into the world of cucumber variety differences and talk about things like parthenocarpy, gynoecious versus monoecious, skin thickness, disease resistances, and cucurbitacin content, all so that you can avoid growing cucumber plants that look like this one. Time to go down the rabbit hole that is the wild world of cucumber varieties. All right, let's get straight into the really super cool stuff. So cucumbers are among a small number of plants that can exhibit parthenocarpy. And parthenocarpy is basically the ability for a plant to grow a mature fruit without that fruit ever having been pollinated, which means a parthenocarpic cucumber, like the one this little female flower came from, can actually grow this little ovule, the little baby fruit at the bottom or the base of a female flower, into maturity without it ever being pollinated by one of these male flowers. We do not need transfer of the pollen from a male flower to a female flower in order for a parthenocarpic cucumber to grow that fruit all the way to full size. That is huge.
Now, unlike tomatoes, all plants in the gourd family and the cucurbit family produce imperfect flowers. They produce both male and female flowers. And in order for those ovules, the little baby fruits on the bottom of a female flower, to develop into a fully mature fruit, we need pollen transfer from the male to the female. For melons or pumpkins, that can kind of not be the biggest deal because we're probably gonna get excess fruit that we're gonna prune off anyways. We're gonna end up with more male and female flowers by the end of the season than we needed, at least in most circumstances. But with cucumbers, we're gonna want all of those little ovules, the fruit on the bottom of a female flower, to develop into a fully mature cucumber. And lack of pollination, either from not enough pollinator insects or perhaps by too much heat or other environmental conditions, can really ruin a crop and make it a disappointing year for our cucumber plants. Just look at this sad little unfertilized cucumber that could have been something delicious.
I spend kind of an embarrassing amount of time on veggie growing forums, and I gotta say, one of the most common complaints that I see about people with their cucumber plants is, hey, it looks healthy, it's putting off flowers, I'm seeing little ovules, female fruits on those flowers, but none of them are maturing into a full-size fruit. What gives? Well, there are a lot of potential reasons for that, but obviously one of the biggest ones, if not the biggest ones, is going to be pollination issues and parthenocarpy. Well, parthenocarpy just short circuits that problem altogether.
Before we move on real quick, I just want to clarify that a parthenocarpic plant can grow these little fruits into maturity without them being pollinated. They will be unpollinated fruits, meaning seedless fruits. They're not going to be self-pollinated, which is kind of a common misconception you're going to see out there.
Most cucumbers produce both male and female flowers on the same plant, same as other cucurbits like squash or melon. So an individual plant has all it needs in order to fruit, but not a single flower, unless of course it's one of those parthenocarpic varieties. That reproductive system where a single plant produces both the male and female flowers required is referred to as monoecious.
Plants that produce only male flowers or only female flowers on a given plant, so you're gonna have one that's all male and one that's all female, and you need both in order for them to cross-pollinate, those are referred to as dioecious. And generally speaking, they're a little bit rarer among our food garden plants, but they're gonna include things like kiwi fruits and even spinach.
Now there's yet another category, and that is gynoecious plants. A gynoecious plant produces most or even all female flowers, and that's the category this beautiful cucumber plant falls into. And I'm going to show you here in a second, but basically this plant right here, it produces almost entirely female fruits. There are a couple males on there, but mostly female. And so what you're going to see here is we've got female, 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 female. All of these have little ovules that are going to turn into cucumbers. It's absolutely loaded with them, right? So why is it cool that we have an option of growing a gynoecious plant with primarily female flowers? Well, you can imagine this plant is going to produce roughly twice as many cucumber fruits as it would if it were a monoecious plant, and at least half of those flowers were male and would never produce a cucumber.
So traditionally, a lot of gynoecious varieties of cucumbers were sold in these packets of primarily gynoecious plants, and then you would have 1 or 2 monoecious plants thrown in there, and then generally they would be labeled or they would be dyed in some way, so it would be really obvious which one was the monoecious plant. And that way the monoecious plant would grow up, it would have the male flowers, and those male flowers would be available to pollinate all the many female flowers on the rest of the gynoecious plants, which comprise sort of the majority of the plants in that seed packet, which is a super cool workaround, but it's not exactly difficult to imagine how that could run into some issues, right? So imagine if that monoecious plant with all the male flowers, it died or succumbed to diseases or was taken out by a pest or just wasn't producing enough flowers, or for whatever reason you weren't having enough pollinator insect activity to really transfer pollen from that monoecious plant with all of its male flowers to all of those gynoecious plants with all their female flowers. It can run into issues really quickly. Or imagine you're in a greenhouse and you barely have any pollinator activity at all, and you have to do all of that pollination by hand. Kind of one thing with tomatoes where we just have to tap them or vibrate them, but with a cucurbit family plant like a cucumber, you'd actually have to go in there and grab that pollen and then manually transfer it to all the female flowers. Not super realistic. I mean, people did it, but it was a lot of work. Well, to the rescue came new varieties of parthenocarpic and gynoecious plants. This little seed is going to produce a plant that produces mostly, not all, but mostly female flowers. And those female flowers, the fruit or the ovule on them, they're not going to require pollination from the male flowers that it does produce or male flowers from any other plant. They are going to just grow into maturity unpollinated. Very, very cool.
So there are now a ton of varieties that fit into that gynoecious category of plants that produce mostly or all female flowers, but that category does not include many of everybody's favorite standbys like straight 8 or Market More 76, or even some of my new favorites like Armenian cucumbers, not really a cucumber, but used as one, or Suyo Long. By the way, I know I've mentioned this a few times, but just to reiterate, a gynoecious plant can produce a small number of male flowers. I see this quite a lot where people are confused why there are male flowers on their gynoecious variety, and that's just because there is some variation in what fits that definition. Some produce basically none, some produce a fair number, but in total you're going to be getting a plant with far fewer male flowers.
So have you ever heard the term burpless used to describe a cucumber? So yeah, for whatever reason, some folks seem to get indigestive issues burping when they eat cucumbers, and some types of cucumbers more than others. And for a long time, it was assumed or it was believed that that quality was caused by a very real set of compounds in cucumbers and other squash plants called cucurbitacins. I can pretty much guarantee you that this little sucker right here would be absolutely chock full of them. Now those compounds, those cucurbitacins, when they enter the fruit, they cause a bitter flavor. So for a very long time, plant breeders worked on creating sweeter, less bitter varieties that had less of those cucurbitacins entering into the cucumber fruit, and they were very successful at that. We now have many varieties that are sweeter or bitter free, and whether or not those cucurbitacins actually cause burping, well, that seems like it's up to debate. First off, and this is on a more serious note, those cucurbitacins can lead to a very serious, very real condition called toxic squash syndrome. I am not a doctor. I am absolutely not qualified to talk about this condition, but if you are a gardener and you are growing plants in the cucurbit family, it is probably worth it for you to read up on it like any other garden danger. Again, that is cucurbitacins and toxic squash syndrome.
On the flavor side of things, I definitely do recommend growing varieties that are labeled as bitter-free or bitterless or just plain old not bitter cucumbers. A lot of the bitterness that enters into cucumbers is down to how the plant is grown, the watering, the heat, many other factors. That's an entire video in and of itself, but we can make it easier on ourselves to grow plants that produce tasty fruits if we select varieties that are not prone to getting a lot of those cucurbitacins into the fruit itself that are bitterless. If you find a variety that you're interested in growing and you're not sure whether or not it is labeled as a bitter-free variety, just know that thin-skinned and low-seed varieties do tend to have less of that bitter quality. Many cucumber varieties were bred specifically to withstand the unique conditions found in protected growing environments, places like hoop houses or greenhouses, and those varieties are often going to prioritize characteristics like good resistance to fungal diseases, right? Not a whole lot of air movement in a greenhouse. Or perhaps parthenocarpy. You can imagine, pretty hard to get enough insect activity to have good pollination inside of a greenhouse. Nice to have a variety that doesn't require pollination to put off a lot of fruit. And then on the flip side of that, a greenhouse grower might not need to care as much about characteristics like hardiness when their plants are protected behind the walls of a hoop house or a greenhouse, and they don't have as much pressure from the elements or as much pressure from insects. That's not to say that we as home gardeners growing outdoors can't try those greenhouse varieties. I really think we can. For instance, I think we would have good success growing them in our backyard in a container. It's relatively secluded. I'm able to make sure it has enough water. There's not so much insect pressure that I think it's going to succumb early in the season, whereas I may not want to put it in our front yard garden where it has a lot less of those sort of protective qualities. We're just trying to be judicious about our plant placement.
Now, thick skin on a cucumber can be very helpful. It can make the fruit hardier and store better, and obviously that's going to be important to commercial growers who are selling their fruit to others, but it can also make that fruit more resistant to the elements, more resistant to insect damage, and obviously that's going to be important to all of us, probably anyways. Thick skin can also basically act as a water retention layer, which means that a thinner skin variety is basically just going to dry out faster after harvest. But in kind of a big caveat here, the thicker skin on, for instance, these American slicer varieties also is positively correlated or associated with that bitter quality, those cucurbitacins. And for that reason, I personally am kind of moving away from these thicker American varieties towards sweeter, thinner skin varieties.
Okay, so I want to take a second here to highlight a specific variety or lineage of cucumbers called the beit alpha. And I want to do that because beit alpha cucumbers, like these right here, which grew into this plant right here, they've become a bit of a sensation lately, and for good reason, but unfortunately that sensational quality has resulted in a fair bit of misinformation out there about this variety or about this type of cucumber. So the beit alpha type cucumber was originally bred in Israel in a kibbutz starting in the 1930s, and since that point it has become absolutely phenomenally popular around the globe, and that popularity, for very good reason, has resulted in a large number of breeding programs using that beit alpha cucumber lineage. I'll link to an article in the description if you want to get a sense of the scale of that breeding, but the point is that while beit alpha cucumbers are often just labeled as beit alpha cucumbers, there's actually a huge degree of variation within the type. And that variation isn't always very well represented within the seed descriptions themselves. For example, you might read or you might hear that beit alpha cucumber varieties are gynoecious, and that is not true. The original landrace out of Israel was monoecious, and you can still find monoecious varieties with both male and female flowers, although I think it's fair to say that the majority of the varieties that you're gonna run across are gynoecious. It is also very often said that all beit alpha varieties are parthenocarpic. They don't require pollination. This one has been a real challenge for me to verify one way or another, so I'm not 100% sure, but it certainly appears to also be false. For instance, check out this variety bred by Cornell University called Green Fingers. It requires pollination pretty clearly right here on the seed description itself. Lastly, you may see that beit alpha cucumbers are greenhouse varieties. They are only appropriate for protected conditions, which is kind of wild because, again, that original landrace out of Israel was very much both a greenhouse and field production appropriate variety. There are definitely lots of varieties that have been specifically bred for greenhouses though, so it is worth looking into. I've really enjoyed growing this beit alpha cucumber here, and I will almost certainly either have the same variety or another beit alpha variety next year. I just want to make sure that you all are able to verify that you are getting a cucumber that matches the characteristics you think you are getting before you hit that purchase button. Many seedless cucumber varieties are simply seedless because they're parthenocarpic. The fruit grew seedless because it was able to mature without ever being pollinated. So if you're growing a parthenocarpic cucumber and seedlessness is a characteristic you really care about, you just need to make sure that those female flowers aren't getting pollinated. Many growers are going to achieve this by physically isolating away their gynoecious parthenocarpic cucumber varieties. And remember, keep in mind here that even
a primarily gynoecious variety, something that only produces 95% female flowers, can still produce the odd male flower. There are also a handful of other plants in the cucurbit family that aren't true cucumbers, but make a pretty good cucumber substitute, like these teeny tiny little baby cucamelon seedlings that aren't much to look at the moment, but will grow into a plant that produces lots of little tiny melons that make a pretty good cucumber substitute. Or this super heat tolerant Armenian cucumber, again, not a true cucumber, it's a melon, but does pretty well in high heat areas, and that allows you to get a cucumber-like fruit if you're struggling with other cucumber varieties. Many popular American varieties of cucumbers are, shocker, not designed to be all that heat tolerant. They were originally bred in the Northeast, like this straight 8 cucumber right here. So if you're growing somewhere very hot, I would definitely suggest looking into a specifically heat tolerant variety, something like Katrina, which is a beit alpha variety of cucumber that is going to do a better job of withstanding those temperatures once you start getting into the high 90s or low 100s or even 110, like we're starting to hit here, for prolonged periods of time. So I think there are basically 2 things to know about disease resistance in cucumbers. First off, it's kind of a myth that only hybrid plants have good disease resistances to offer. If you know that you want an open pollinated plant where you can save those seeds and they'll grow true to seed, it's still worth looking at your heirloom options and kind of seeing which ones match the disease resistances that are relevant to your growing context. For instance, this is Marketmore 76. Obviously that is a old, very popular heirloom variety. Many folks grow it. You can definitely save these seeds and regrow them. And you can see right on the back here, it's got good resistance to things like scab and mosaic viruses. And I know for myself, personally, cucumber mosaic virus is a major issue in my garden, particularly a little bit later in summer as those whiteflies start doing their thing. And 2, cucumber plant breeders have done just an absolutely phenomenal job of creating plants with a really wide variety of relevant disease resistances. I mentioned I need resistance to cucumber mosaic virus. Maybe you need something else. I will say if you can find something with a little bit of protection from downy mildew, powdery mildew, those are probably going to be relevant for just about any context. Productivity refers to the amount of cucumber that you're going to get off your plant, and oftentimes it is talking about simply the number of fruit that that plant is able to put off at a given time. But I think it's important to remember that a healthy plant with a moderate number of fruits that is going to last all the way into fall is probably going to outproduce in real world conditions a less healthy plant that succumbs to disease early in the season, even if that less healthy plant was putting off a ton of fruit early on. Now that said, when it comes to actually selecting a variety that is highly productive, I think there are 2 easy things you can look for. The first is going to be, is that plant gynoecious? Well, if it is, you've just about doubled your harvest with no additional work on your part. That is pretty hard to beat. Honestly, growing gynoecious varieties feels a little bit like a cheat code after coming from monoecious varieties. And the second is that fruit multipistillate? Is it multi-fruiting? And all that means is, does your cucumber variety support the ability to produce multiple little female flowers on each node rather than just one? Many cucumber varieties can produce 2, 3, or even 4 fruit on each of those leaf nodes, which wildly increases the number of total fruits it can put off. Oftentimes this quality is associated with cucumber varieties that produce smaller fruits. It is a little difficult for a plant to support 3 or 4 really large slicers on each one of those nodes, but pretty realistic if we're talking about cocktail varieties, for instance. Like tomatoes, most cucumber varieties are large, vining, indeterminate plants. They're gonna grow and continue producing all the way until frost or disease takes them out. There are, however, some smaller bush varieties that are often marketed as being appropriate for containers, but I do want to just say real quickly, it is totally possible. In fact, I think in some ways advantageous to grow a large vining variety like this beit alpha we have growing right here in a 10-gallon fabric grow bag in a container. Works really well, so don't feel limited on that front if you want to grow a larger variety but have only a container garden. So do you want a slicer cucumber to put into salads and sandwiches? Do you want a stocky pickling cucumber to preserve for later in the year? Do you want a nice cocktail cucumber to just grab off the vine and munch on? Pickling cucumbers tend to prioritize skin where the brining liquid can enter fairly easily and flesh that holds up to that pickling process well. Slicer varieties tend to be a little bit longer, a little bit larger, have that thicker skin for better storage. Cocktail cucumbers tend to be a little bit crunchier, thin skin, sweeter, prioritize really good flavor for just eating fresh. And ultimately, I think that those use case characteristics or those use case groupings are kind of a little bit less important again than things like bitter-free or parthenocarpic or gynoecious, right? Things that we as home gardeners are probably going to care a little bit more about. Now, obviously, if you're a market gardener or a farmer and you're selling your produce, that's a little bit different. You have to care about marketing that produce for a specific use case. But again, I would personally encourage you to kind of think about what are your goals, what are you trying to get out of the plant, and how are you going to get to the biggest harvest that meets those goals. And I don't really think saying something is an English slicer variety is particularly important for meeting that objective. So one final quick tip here is just going to be to ask your favorite seed producers if they have any plants that match your wish list. Is the one you're looking at gynoecious? Is it parthenocarpic? How big does it grow? Is it heat tolerant? Whatever you're interested in. In my experience, you're probably going to be connected to somebody who loves gardening as much as you do. And that is all I've got on the topic of selecting a cucumber variety. Happy gardening, y'all, and I hope to see you on the next one.